Part 4 of the ecology notes will be on ecosystems and succession. There are two types of systems that we will discuss in this class. The first is called an open system. Open systems exchange both matter and energy with their environment. For example, minerals and nutrients and water plus gases are examples of matter that can be exchanged between organisms and between their environment, such as the atmosphere. And energy would be something like the sun's energy is coming in to the system, it's being used up by the organisms, it could be transferred through the food chains and ultimately lost as heat. Natural systems are open systems, so that means all ecosystems in nature are open systems. The second type of system is called a closed system. Closed systems do not exchange matter, but they do exchange energy. So a good example of this is going to be our mesocosms that we are going to build within this unit. The mesocosm will be a self-sustaining ecosystem. You will have to include both plants and animals in your mesocosm project, and you will have to balance the ecosystem in a closed system, which means you will seal it off. Gases will not be exchanged between the mesocosm and the outer environment because you have sealed it off. However, energy will be. We'll put it in the window. The mesocosm vessel that you'll use will be translucent, so light energy will be able to enter and heat will be able to escape. An ecosystem, remember, is a system that is formed by interactions between the living organisms within their community as well as the abiotic components of their environment. This is what makes it different from just a community. In the last section of notes, we talked about communities, interactions between organisms that live close together within their particular area. But now we're also including the abiotic components for the ecosystem. How a species is distributed within an ecosystem will depend on the abiotic factors that are surrounding that particular species. For example, the distribution of a plant species will be limited by many abiotic factors that put stresses on the plants. For example, temperature, nutrient availability in the soil, or any chemicals that could potentially cause harm within the soil as well. Access to light, the pH of the soil, how much salt is in the soil. All of these things will put limit on plant distribution within a particular ecosystem. Here's an animal example. This graph shows the mallard duck distributions within certain years, and you can see that when temperatures fluctuate, if temperature is warmer, it allows for the mallard ducks to be distributed farther north versus when the temperature is less, then they can't go as far north. It's too cold. Organisms don't just have like one specific subset of temperatures or other environmental factors that they can tolerate. There's typically a range of these environmental factors that they are able to tolerate. And so we call these like the range of tolerances. This graph shows the range of tolerances for different organisms. On the x-axis, an environmental factor will be graphed along a gradient. So, if we're looking at pH, these are going to be low pHs, and then these are going to be the high pHs. If we're looking at temperature, same thing, low temperature, high temperature. The y-axis will graph the population size or number of organisms. This middle section of the graph represents the optimum range at which organisms are able to do their best, to live at their best. Adaptations of species are going to lead to their fundamental niche, which remember means if they had ideal conditions, this is where they could potentially live, versus if they are being competed by other types of species, it's likely to result in a reduction of their niche, which is called the realized niche. So we talked a little bit about that last unit, but this all relates to this type of graph. So again, because of their adaptations, they have this range of tolerance that they're able to live in. This is the preferred niche. However, when some of these environmental factors are too low or too high, then it puts them in what's called the zones of stress. These organisms are population size is drastically decreasing because of the resources that are around them that are limiting them. And then beyond the zone of stress will be your zones of intolerance. This is not a niche that's available for these organisms to live in. It's not possible for them to tolerate those particular niches. They do not have the adaptation for that. And so you can see that there's 0 organisms alive within those particular conditions. We'll go through several examples of adaptations that species may have that gives them this range of tolerance. Starting off with plants. Plants that live in our northern ecosystems, they're constantly exposed to extremely cold temperatures, and so they actually have chemicals within their cells that act like antifreeze, whereas tropical plants would not be able to survive the frost because they lack these chemicals. If we then look at tropical plants, remember they have adaptations that allow for them to live in really hot conditions. And so during this time, they would have to have adaptations to minimize both transpiration, which is the evaporative water loss from plants, and photorespiration, which we talked about in a previous unit. We talked about plants having C4 physiology or CAM physiology that would allow for them to adapt to these types of environments. Plants that are adapted to northern climates would not be able to photosynthesize well in these tropical climates. They don't have those adaptations that allow for that. For animal examples, we've talked about ear size and what that has to do with heat dissipation. Elephants live in really high temperatures, and so they have big ears to help them release excess heat. That way it keeps their overall body temperature cooler. Versus polar bears live in really cold temperatures. They have small ears to minimize that heat loss. It helps them to maintain their heat within their body. Here's another example of different plant adaptations. This is a forest. In environments where plants have plenty of water, the right temperature, it ends up allowing for them to compete for light. That will be their limiting resource, and that will cause a forest ecosystem to occur with different plants being able to live in the different components of that ecosystem. So when we look at these really tall trees, you can see those tall trees form this like tall canopy, or they're beyond the canopy actually, and so they're able to get the best access to light. Then we have the trees that occupy the upper canopy. They're still getting good access to light. We have lianas, which are kind of like vines that can grow upwards on plants and link from tree to tree. And this also allows for them to get more upwards and have good access to light. We have epiphytes shown here and here, which remember they are plants that grow on top of other plants in a commensalistic relationship. They do not cause harm to the plant they grow on top of, but because they can reach higher areas, it gives them better access to light than they would have if they had to grow on the forest floor. Strangler epiphytes are different. I'll show you a picture of this in a second, but they actually only spend the beginning portions of their life cycle as an epiphyte, where they tend to grow upward on a plant, not causing harm to their host tree. But then at some point within their lifespan, they also start to grow downwards. And this is when they do start to cause harm to the tree. So at that point, they're no longer an epiphyte. They're actually considered hemi-epiphytes because they only spend part of their life cycle as an actual epiphyte, and the rest of their life cycle they cause harm to the plant. So what they do is they grow down, which is pretty atypical of a traditional epiphyte. So they're going to grow down until ultimately their roots will reach the soil, and as they grow downwards, they're wrapping around the trees, and ultimately they're kind of strangling the tree. That's how they get their name. They will end up killing the tree. And so the tree will end up dying, decomposing, and then we will be left with this epiphyte kind of skeleton of the strangler epiphyte. I'll show you a picture of this in a second. It's kind of neat. And then towards the bottom of the forest, we have our shade-tolerant shrubs and herbs that will grow closer to the forest floor. They don't need as much light. They can tolerate the shade from the canopy above. Here's a picture of a strangler epiphyte. So you can see that it's hollowed out because the tree inside of it is already dead and has already decayed and been broken down. But the outer strangler plant is still there now and rooted into the ground. What's neat about these types of plants is they are sometimes a keystone species to that particular environment. They have a lot of little niches inside of them that allow for unique homes for a lot of organisms. Birds will nest in them and so on. They also produce fruit, and so that fruit actually provides food to a lot of different organisms. They often are able to grow food when other plants cannot, and so it's a good adaptation, and it tends to be a good organism to have around. It's bad for the tree that it strangled, but it's good for a lot of other organisms. Succession is when an ecosystem goes through changes or transformations that occur over long periods of time. So it's like an ecosystem kind of turns from one ecosystem to another, to another, to another. And this is going to be influenced by both biotic factors and abiotic factors within the environment. Abiotic factors will set limits to the distribution of the living organisms, and in return, these living organisms will use those abiotic factors and also set limits on those. And so it's kind of like this cycle that goes back and forth between the living organisms and their abiotic environment. We will talk about two categories of succession, primary and secondary. Primary succession begins with an environment that does not have any living organisms yet. It is just bare rock. For example, a retreating glacier where new rock has been exposed, where it has been covered for long periods of time. Or perhaps a volcano that has erupted, covering the entire area in lava that ultimately hardens into magma, and it has killed everything around it. So now it's bare rock once again. Typically, the first organisms that come in to colonize are incredibly simple organisms that don't really need a lot. For example, bacteria or lichens or mosses. As these organisms start to become successful, they will loosen up the rock and create little bits of soil. Once we have little bits of soil present, smaller plants can come in and start to colonize. Their roots will grow down into the soil, deeper and deeper, and loosen up more soil. That will then open up new niches for plants with deeper roots, and so on. Over time, we get larger and larger plants that are able to colonize as more soil has developed. Eventually, once there's enough changes within the plant community, it will allow for other types of organisms to be able to colonize. For example, animals and decomposers. The more organisms we have within these communities, the more nutrients that become available to other organisms, and more complex food webs will develop. Each organism that is brought into the ecosystem creates changes or transformations within that ecosystem. That is succession. So slow changes that are occurring within an ecosystem over a period of time. So you can see that in the picture here. We have bare rock, small simple organisms colonize, they start to loosen up the soil, and over time we get more complex plant species that eventually will allow for the niches that are good for animals and decomposers. Eventually, potentially reaching the climax community, which is considered a stable ecosystem. This typically takes hundreds of years, maybe 500 years or 1,000 years. It takes a long time to get to that climax community. Here's an example. In 1980, Mount St. Helens, which is a volcano in Washington, erupted. So before it erupted, it was lush all around the volcano. And then the lava came and hardened and killed everything. And so now you can see that it is becoming grown once again, but it will take time for it to reach the how green it used to be due to it having to start back at primary succession. Secondary succession is different because it does not start with bare rock. It starts with an ecosystem that was already present that has gone through some type of disturbance and wiped out a significant portion of the species. So because it's going to start with soil already present, we're able to have a lot of organisms come in at the beginning and have a lot of organisms that take on those niches, and a lot of diversity and biomass will accumulate close to the beginning of this particular disturbance. Good examples of this would be like fire, for example. Fire comes in, kills a lot of organisms that live there, run the animals out, and so on, but we still have soil, and so that soil can allow for quick and easy kind of transformations of plants to be able to come in and start to colonize once again. It can also be human-induced, so construction sites or unused roads or meadows that have been abandoned, or forests that have been cleared, things like that. But you have to start with soil already. We're not starting with nothing like we were in primary succession. So here you can see it occurs much faster than primary succession. It says around 150 years or so, which I know is still a long time, but it's not anywhere near as long as 500 to 1,000 years like primary succession. So we have fire, and then you already have soil present. So then the plants that would normally just come up annually can. Other seeded plants can be brought there by wind, for example. We start to get that growth of these earlier species, and then again each species brings about changes to the ecosystem that allows for new niches for other species, and so on. Eventually it will reach that climax community faster than you would for primary succession. Changes do still always occur at a primary succession, at a climax community, but much slower than they would throughout the actual series of successive events. So here shows you right after the fire and then sometime after the fire. So a lot of things die, and look how quickly it becomes green once again. We actually have experienced this a lot in Southern California, and even right here in Newbury Park, there is Satwiwa, which is a protected area, but fire came a while ago and really destroyed a lot of that area. And it's coming back. We've had a lot of years with really good rain, and that has allowed for a lot of plants to come in and, really have the water that they need to make a comeback. Satwiwa actually has little kind of pillars set up where you can set your cell phone on and take a picture, and you can send it to their website, and they're actually tracking succession after that fire, which is kind of neat. What triggers succession? It can be a lot of things. It can be an abiotic or a biotic trigger. Examples of abiotic triggers would be like glaciers that retreat, or avalanches that, as they're coming down the mountain, they take away the plants, the forest, and everything that's along with it, and then expose bare rock where the avalanche started or with everything it wiped out. Could be an erupting volcano. Those are all abiotic. Biotic triggers would be when a living organism comes in and makes a major change to that ecosystem. So a good example of this is beavers. Beavers can come in and colonize a river ecosystem, and when they do that, they chop down the wood of the surrounding forest area, and they dam up the river by doing that. Well, when they dam up the river, they change that river and forest ecosystem to a swampland because it causes a lot of flooding, and that flooding is going to kill the trees that would normally live around there. Again, every organism that is brought into the environment causes changes to that environment. That is succession. Over time, more organic matter will continue to accumulate during these successive phases, opening up new niches, and each species will come in, occupy a niche. This will lead to competition, and ultimately some will survive, eventually leading to hopefully a climax community, which is stable, There are ecosystems that have been stable for over 150 million years. In order for an ecosystem to reach that stable climax community, they would have to have a constant supply of energy. They'd have to be able to recycle nutrients. So good selection of decomposers that return those nutrients to the soil. They have to have genetic diversity, which leads to adaptation and high chance of survival. So lots of different types of organisms that live there, all different from each other. And then they have to have the right climate and abiotic factors that allow for these organisms to remain within their tolerance limits. Not all ecosystems will reach a climax community. Some actually go back and forth with cycles between ecosystems. So it's sort of like a cyclical succession. There's several examples listed here. Oak forests cannot regenerate new oak trees because the seedlings that develop are shade intolerant. So when the oak trees start to die, it allows for the grasslands to develop. Well, once the grasslands develop, the oak seedlings can germinate in the grasses, and without the oak canopy above it, it will be able to now sprout up and grow, and it will go back to a forest once again. So back and forth between grassland and forest. On New Zealand's rocky shores, we have barnacles that will settle along the rocky shore. And then algae will be able to also come in and colonize, but then the mussels come and they settle on top of those organisms and they tend to smother them, killing the barnacles and the algae. So it quickly turns into like a mussel ecosystem. Eventually the mussels will detach, re-exposing the bare rock. And then once again, the barnacles and the algae will come in. It goes back and forth between those two ecosystems. In Southern California, along the coast, we have a lot of chaparral ecosystems, which are like shrub-like or, kind of like dry grasses that can tolerate high salt levels typically along the coastline. And about every 10 to 15 years, fire comes in, wipes it out. But then it ultimately, within just a few years, typically reverts back to that chaparral ecosystem. So it cycles back and forth between chaparral and burned, essentially. There's also something called arrested succession. Arrested means like paused or halted. Something has stopped succession from occurring. And we're talking about natural succession. Something has stopped the natural progression of succession within that ecosystem from occurring. This is usually human influenced, usually induced by humans. If instead of the natural ecosystem developing, an alternative stable ecosystem develops, this would be called a plagioclimax community. So it's just a different climax community. It's not the one that nature necessarily intended, but it is stable, just in an alternative way. So examples are in pastures where humans will clear the land and they'll grow grasses and then they'll raise grazing animals like cows or goats, sheep, and these organisms will graze along the grasslands, maintaining that grass-like ecosystem. But because the grasslands are being maintained by those organisms, it's preventing a forest from forming. If we didn't have the grazers, conditions would be right for a forest to form within those areas. You see this a lot in the Midwest. There's a lot of cows raised in the Midwest. This can also occur naturally, so not human-induced necessarily. On the North American Great Plains, which is to the east of the Rocky Mountains, there are a lot of bison that live in the Midwest over there, and they naturally graze the land and keep it a grassland instead of a forest. Another example is in the taiga biome, which remember can be quite cold. There are going to be some wetlands that potentially develop, which form peat bogs that allow for mosses to come in and essentially kind of take over. Mosses need a lot of moisture. But when humans want to grow crops, they often drain these wetlands to allow for more land to be developed into croplands. And so when that happens, we'll now use it as croplands for that. But if they decide not to cultivate it anymore, then it can quickly go, if it stays dry, if they keep draining it, it can then turn into a forest. Or if they decide not to drain it anymore, then it will go back to wetland. And that is the end of the part 4 now.